Hi, everybody. I'm Meg Carpenter, the CEO here at FICOM Partners, and I am so appreciative that you are here and giving me some more of your time to engage in our series around organic growth and how really amazing advisors and advisory firms are driving towards organic growth in ways that I think are so important that I want to make sure you hear about them. And today I am honored to have Adam Cmejla as my guest on this organic growth series. Adam is the founder and wealth advisor at Integrated Planning and Wealth Management. Adam, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you, Meg, for the opportunity and privilege. I'm excited for our conversation today.
Me too. I feel like we have so much to talk about. Before we sort of dive into our conversation that's specifically around organic growth, I'd love for you, Adam, just to set the stage, give the advisors who are listening, just give them a quick background about you and your firm so that they know sort of like size, years in the business,
Sure.
that type of thing.
So I am coming up on, what is this now, 15 years in the business. I say the first probably 10 years or so were accidental or kind of intentionally accidental. The last 5 years have been very pivotal in the growth of the firm. We are currently a team of 5 spread out across 3 different states, and we serve clients in 35 states, I think, as of the time of this recording. And we are a little bit weird in a sense, and this is what we'll talk about in our conversation today, in that as I was prepping for our conversation, in the last 5 years, we have only worked with one person that is not an optometrist. And more specifically, lately, when I say lately, over the past 3 to 4 years or so, we specifically work with optometric private practice owners that are typically doing at least $850,000 in top line revenue in their practice or higher. That is our client avatar that we work with.
Super specific. And we're going to dive into sort of how you got to where you are today. I've learned so much from you, Adam. I've had the opportunity to meet you through Limitless Advisor, where I know that you're a coach. So in addition to leading a very successful RIA business, you're also very generous with your time and coaching other advisors. And so that's how you and I first met and have sort of just become a fan and quite fascinated by how focused and disciplined your business is and what the outcomes have been, which is really what I want to be able to demonstrate back to the industry, because I find that sometimes I can be sharing my experience. You know, I've been working with financial advisors and advisory firms for over 20 years. This is everything that I've done, and I've seen it all. I've experienced it all. But I'm not an advisor. So I love to be able to sort of highlight people like you who are a real demonstration of sort of what's possible. And so you mentioned, 10 years, maybe like first 10 out of the 15 years, accidental, unintentional. And I know when you and I were prepping for this, you've sort of talked about some of the decisions that you made 3-4 years ago to get really intentional about growth. So if we rewind back to that time in your business, I think it was around 2019, 2020. What was going on in your business at that time where you said to yourself, you know what, I need to do this different?
There were 2 very big disconnects and pieces missing from the puzzle as I was looking at the business. Number one, I wasn't clear on the value that I was delivering to the relationships that I was serving. And it was difficult for me to do that because I didn't have clarity about who I wanted to do my best work for. I was, as you would call it, a master of the ones. I had a client over in this profession. I had a client over in this profession. I had one over here. I had a 24-year-old school teacher here. And then my next appointment would be with a 75-year-old retired mechanical engineer from ABC company, right? I just didn't have a focused group of clientele that I knew what their common problems were. And therefore, I could show up as the best first-rate version of myself, deliver the value that they were looking for, and solve the problems that they all had, and charge appropriately for that. So it became, everything else in the business was harder to do because I lacked clarity on those 2 key cornerstone pieces of the puzzle.
How did that show up? Like, how is that showing up that you recognized it?
I'll never forget. So this is, and I have it printed out. So my first year in Limitless Advisor was 2018. It was the founding year of the program. And I remember a conversation that we had. It was a written conversation. I printed that conversation. It is 16 pages long, single-spaced Word document. It essentially was like my manifesto of all the things that I had been messing up until that point. And one of the key items that I uncovered about myself through journaling. And sidebar, that has been one of the most impactful things that I have done for myself to figure out what I'm thinking. There's a phrase and a quote out there. I don't know who to attribute to. It's certainly not me, but I didn't know what I was thinking until I started writing. And that is a very, very true statement, at least for myself. So the act of journaling and writing was very profound and powerful for me. And one of the ways that was showing up is because I wasn't clear about who I wanted to work with, I'd work with anybody. So I was like, I remember writing in my journal, I was a nomad, essentially wandering through the desert. And we were taught as advisors from the get-go in this business at the bright age of 24, I think it was 24, 25. And the firm that I first started with so affectionately gave me a desk and a phone. We were taught that yes is good, no is bad. And so as an advisor, anytime somebody said yes, oh, great, let's go, without any type of intentionality or understanding about what the consequences, good or bad, of that decision was going to be. And the unfortunate byproduct of that was that I was accidentally successful. I had made it through the hard part of the advisory, the first couple of years, and 10 years later, I still had a struggling practice that had, as of 2017, I still had yet to crest $250,000 in top line revenue, because I was just saying yes to everybody. I was like a nomad walking through the desert, looking for a bottle of water, looking for a picnic basket. And every time I found one, a client, I would say yes, not really caring whether this was nutritious for me or not. I have a whole nother metaphor about how I evaluate the validity of a client as it pertains to nutrition. Maybe we'll get to that metaphor here. But once I hit pause on that and started becoming intentional about the type of business that I wanted to create and what levers I needed to pull to make that happen, that's where everything just kickstarted from there. And it started with defining how I was going to show up and what value I was deliver, and then who I was going to do that for.
And so coming out of that, getting clear on the value that you were delivering and who you were delivering it to, what were some intentional decisions that you made in your business on top of that, once you had that clarity?
So I knew that I liked working with business owners. I'm a third generation business owner myself. I was owning my firm. So I knew that I liked that aspect of business. So that was kind of the first filter, if you will, that I took who I wanted to work with and what problems that I could help solve for them. And so the first iteration of that was I was going to work with white coats. I was going to work with optometrists, dentists, pharmacists, and physicians, right? I can't be too specific because if I still have this in my mind if I got to say yes. So that was the first iteration of slowly getting comfortable with the idea of saying no to someone. But yet that first version of my mindset shift was, all right, I'm being a little bit specific here. I'll work with white coats and say no to everybody else. But it didn't take too long to realize that that was going to be a failed endeavor in and of itself.
Because
I knew you were going to, I should have just kept going. Sorry. I didn't know if you maybe wanted to follow, if there was anything that I had said previously before we got into that. So the reason it was a failure was, and this is going to lead into the single best decision that I ever made as it pertains to organic marketing growth. I chose podcasting as the channel that I wanted to go down in late 2018 into 2019. I started to get a little bit more momentum behind what this would look like. And so the original title of the podcast that I started in late 2028, it wasn't 2018, excuse me, in 2018 was, you'll love this. This is almost cringeworthy from a marketing standpoint. A Dose of Financial Sense. Sense was spelled C-E-N-T-S. Yeah, see, you knew where I was going with that even before I
I've seen a few of those podcasts on the market.
Oh, it's cringeworthy to even admit that right now. And if you look at what is now branded 2020 Money, coming up on 260 episodes, the Libsyn feed, the URL for the podcast, is still A Dose of Financial Sense, because I didn't want to, whatever listenership we had created, I didn't want to rock the boat on that when we rebranded. But coming back to your original question, the reason that I knew very early on that even getting quote unquote specifically vague with white coats is because if I was going to choose podcasting and it was optometrists, dentists, pharmacists, and physicians, if I did an episode on, within the pharmacy world, I had a couple of relationships with CVS. If I do an episode on how restricted stock units work within CVS's comp plan, every dentist, every optometrist, every physician is like, what? This episode's not. Yeah. And then if I do an example of how to navigate the contract negotiations to maximize your RVUs, which is, I pretend like I know what I'm talking about, but I really don't. Anybody that works with physicians will probably point out the flaws in that title right there. It's a way that physicians are, it's a compensation structure or formula built into physician contracts. Well, my dentist, my optometrist, my CVS, like, so you get where I'm going, right?
Yep.
And what that exercise did is it created the foundational, not theory, what am I trying, like the thesis and this covenant that I made with myself. And this idea is that and this is what I would impress upon every advisor listening right now. And I promise you this is true because I've done it and I know so many other advisors that have done it with success. The narrower you take your market, the easier everything in your business becomes. Everything. Because you now are speaking to somebody specific. You are now targeting a message to your unique client avatar, to your ideal client avatar, and you're solving their problem. When you get comfortable that by virtue of you alienating 99.993% of the general population and know that the 0.007% that find you, everything else, it is an amazing feeling and an amazing result that happens. The challenge is most advisors are still stuck in the scarcity mindset of yes is good, no is bad. And if you flip that script, I mean, it is a blue ocean that opens up.
The yes is good, no is bad mindset for sure. And then there's also, I think, there's a fear, right? There's a fear of going really narrow. There's a fear of, I've heard so many advisors say to me, like, what if it's too small? Like, what if it can't sustain me? What if I can't get in front of enough of that 0.07% of the market to make it worth my while? Or another, and these fears are all valid. Another one that I hear is they're valid because they're real to the advisor, right?
Exactly. I was going to come back to that. Thank you for squashing that.
Yes. Not valid from a marketing perspective, but valid in the sense that it's a real fear for the people that I speak with. And I know you do too, is, well, I've got a client base I've got 200 clients already, and only maybe 3% of them are owners of optometric practices that do 850,000 of top line revenue. So I literally can't focus there because of all of this. So how did you work through that?
The first thing that I would say is your clients care about your success as much as they do. I mean, I shouldn't say as much as their own, right? They want you to be successful. And a false story that advisors will tell themselves is that if I start putting myself out there in the public marketplace, that I'm taking my firm in this direction, all my clients are going to leave me.
Right.
And I will say, having done that, I had one. So my mistake, if I'm being truthful and transparent in this conversation, is I did not do, if I would go back and change one thing differently as it relates to that question, I would have done a little bit better job of proactively communicating with our clients, our existing clients that were not optometrists. This is the direction that the firm is going. We did end up parting ways with one client. It was a retired client. And it was, at the time for my practice, it was a decent client. It was kind of sad. Hindsight, they were a train wreck anyway. I was fine to, like, they're one of those clients that you don't want to be around when the proverbial ship sinks. But at the time, it kind of stung. So my point with that is, your clients care that you are going to be there delivering the value in the experience that you promise them, hopefully explicitly by defining your client engagement standards and the service model that you're going to deliver to them, et cetera. Assuming that you've done that, they're fine to see you grow. They just want to know that you're going to be there to take care of them. I promise you that's all it is.
So you didn't have to offload all of the clients that you were working with. It's just that it was from a marketing perspective. You got really narrow and well-defined and quite disciplined about who you're speaking to with your marketing efforts for new prospects coming into the top of your funnel.
Correct. And from a service model, not to digress too far down a rabbit hole, not to digress too far down the rabbit hole, but from a service model standpoint for our existing clients and how we kind of reconciled that with our new practice owners that we were bringing on board, we kind of did what we're calling kind of this wedding cake tier of service. So everybody gets a baseline level of planning. And then for our practice owners that require that additional handholding, those additional value conversations, deliverables, advice, it's an and conversation, but we can still deliver. Like, As a practice owner, they still need financial planning.
Right.
They still need tax planning and estate planning and risk management conversations and cash flow investment plans. So they're no different than ABC or, Joe Schmo client. It's just the and that's different. It's how the income was generated. But for the vast majority of our clients that were already in that space, we didn't have to modify the service model much. It was just adding and becoming more specialized with our new clients that fit the niche.
Mm-hmm. So I love that the decision to do a podcast sort of helped you uncover an opportunity to even further narrow your market from, white coats to this very specific practice owners of optometry businesses who do $850,000 or more in revenue. Because to me, that's the beauty of marketing done right, which is when you're really clear on why you do what you do and who you do it for, everything else becomes fairly intuitive. It's obvious because you're super clear. But I love that you actually had, you went down that way and you tried to go a little bit more, like, to use your phrase, vaguely specific on white coats. And then you're doing a podcast and you're actually going through the process of concepting, launching a podcast, putting together, a content calendar with topics and what you're going to talk about. And it becomes evidently, immediately evident that, still not quite narrow enough. And so I just think that that's such a beautiful representation of the power of marketing, is that when it's aligned to your vision and your values and you're very, very clear on that, it actually drives the most incredible marketing success. I mean, did you imagine, and I'd love to actually for you to talk to us a little bit about the evolution that's happened over the last several years, what you've experienced and what you've learned, but did you anticipate that in 2023, you would be having the growth numbers that you're having year over year, that your business would be the size that it is, that you would be so fulfilled?
I would like to say yes. I know. No, I didn't. And I don't mean that to be cliche. It's I had no idea it would be this. I knew that I had seen other advisors be successful with podcasting. So I was not the trailblazer here. I was not the first advisor to start a podcast. I mean, going all the way back to Jeff Rose and Good Financial Sense and his platform, Benjamin Brandt with Retirement Starts Today Radio, Taylor Schulte and Stay Well. I mean, there's probably half a dozen advisors that I could list that had very successful podcasts that translated into business success for them in their respective firms. So I was essentially piggybacking off of what they had done with a twist on how I was going to do it. The difference between all of their podcasts and my podcast was they're shooting with a shotgun, I'm aiming with a rifle. They're trying to appeal to, in those examples, right? Jeff Rose and the general population, Taylor and Ben, to be specific, more on the retiree side of things. I was targeting optometric private practice owners that do at least $850,000 in revenue. And there was a time period where I was very heavily focused on practice transitions because private equity was very prevalent in the optometry space as well. So my download numbers were I was missing a zero off of download numbers relative to Ben and Taylor. But the interesting thing was the volume of qualified prospects that I was getting was on par or sometimes greater than what I think others were getting. So I knew I had the playbook. And I think that's what advisors need to realize. If you're watching this and you have that fear of, oh, this can't work for me, I didn't blaze something brand new, right? I'm not this visionary that blazed a trail in the forest where nobody has ever been before. All I did was take a concept that I saw be proven by someone else, go into it with a plan of action, with a clear vision of who I was messaging it towards, build an action plan of what I'm going to do, when I'm going to do it, how I'm going to do it, surround myself with the team to do all the things that are not the best and highest use of my time, calendar it appropriately so that I have the accountability in place to execute on it. And then, as I know, Stephanie Bogan and Limitless is fond of saying, I think you're fond of saying this as well, a good marketing plan is the back of a freaking shampoo bottle. Right. Lather, rinse, repeat. And so that's what I did with the podcast. And, so that's what I would tell advisors that are watching right now that are still questioning this, or, Adam's special. I don't have Adam's. No, I promise you, you can do this. I am not the brightest I'm not the brightest crayon in the box. I just find people that have been successful in doing this and reconcile their action plan against your definition of success. And if your question as an advisor, I'm going to come back to something that you had said about fear that you hear from advisors in doing this is, oh, well, my audience isn't that big enough. I had that fear when I was doing this, because when I wanted to distill down even further, when I was struggling on the content creation side of, well, I can't do, optometrist, dentist, physician, pharmacist, can't do the podcast. Like, how do I do? I can't just do optometrists. That's not going to work, until I did the math and realized that there's 30,000 plus optometrists nationwide. And if I can create the infrastructure to serve clients where geography doesn't matter, do I think, at the time my goal was 70 households, do I think that I can find 70 optometrists out of a pool of 30,000 plus nationwide? Yeah, I can. So it's the reason I love math, right? It's unemotional and it doesn't lie. So that number right there is what gave me the blue ocean mentality and that elixir. So when that fear came back, because just because you squash it once doesn't mean it's not going to come back again, I went to the math and it's like, no, it'll work. X numbers of downloads produces Y number of triage calls, which is what we call an initial prospect call with a potential relationship. X numbers of downloads translates to Y number of prospect calls, which translates to Z number of clients. Lather, rinse, repeat.
Did you know what those metrics were going to be, or that's something you've learned over time?
Not a clue. Learned over time.
Yeah.
I didn't even have, like, I'm sure there was data at the time because podcasting, I had attended Podcast Movement a couple of times early on, but I didn't come across any very niche show like that. A lot of them were bigger shows and they were more on the ad side of things. So no, I didn't know what those numbers were going to be.
Well, and it's not black and white. I mean, to your point,
Right.
If you're looking at the podcast, and I know Taylor's very well, and he sort of, I think, does a good job of narrowing in on like the psychographics of the type of retirees that he wants to work with. So even though it feels big, I think he still has like he's narrowing it in more on psychographics than demographics. But his show and your show are quite different. And so when we think about marketing metrics and metrics that matter, it's hard to answer that question because it's so specific on, like, your podcast is so narrowly focused, and you've got 30,000 potential practice owners out there that are your target. Is you have to build a baseline, and then you have to understand, like, is the baseline okay? Like, does this work for me and where my business is going? And then how do you continue to refine to make sure that you're continuing to improve on those metrics? But your metrics are like that you're tracking as far as number of downloads to the number of triage and working through your funnel. Those numbers are going to be different than someone else who's maybe not doing a podcast, but they're doing a webinar series, whatever it might be. Like, so we often talk a little bit about, like, don't worry about the vanity metrics. I don't actually care. If someone says to me, well, my email open rate is 60%, and that's 6 times the industry average. I'm like, cool. Are those people qualified?
How many calls have you done?
It's
qualified individuals. Exactly.
Yeah. It's just a percentage. It doesn't really mean anything. What means something is when they're coming in and they're the right type of prospect, they're qualified, and you've worked them through the funnel to a place that when you're basically having the first meeting, they're just wanting to make sure that you're going to say, yeah, I can work with you, instead of the other way around. Like, so that's how we try to measure success. But it's validating to hear from you, like, no, I didn't know what those conversion metrics were going to be.
I didn't even look at downloads for the first 90 days of the podcast. I told my producer, I do not want to know. I do not want. I'm going to suck anyway. Sorry, I shouldn't use such bad words on this conversation.
Oh, you're welcome here.
I didn't. I knew that I was starting out from nothing. I mean, listenership was 0. I knew it was just my mom and my wife that were listening, as the joke goes. So I didn't care about downloads. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that as the show progressed and as advisors that are choosing their channel, right, if it's podcasting or YouTube or blogging or speaking, I'm putting an emphasis on or, because I think one of the challenges that advisors have is we love shiny objects and we love to do this and unless you are planning to write a big check to have an entire team around you help you with all these things, you are only one person. So choose one thing, do it extremely well, and you will find that by doing that one thing very well, which is what I found with the podcast, it led to speaking engagements. It led to writing opportunities. It led to, yes, client relationships. It led to other introductions to other centers of influence that also serve the optometric space. So there's so many different secondary and tertiary benefits to the podcast, but you don't get those at-bats unless you first lay the foundation to build the audience, become a student of your craft, and candidly get good at it.
Mm.
Once you start getting that metric, yes, then as Peter Drucker says, what gets measured gets managed, and what gets managed gets improved. So now that you have a baseline, you can start tweaking those numbers and start getting a trend for where your numbers are showing up and what you can control in that equation.
But it's about refinement at that point. It's like,
Yes.
it's
Ready,
refinement
fire,
and
aim.
iteration. And it also, I think when you're at the point that you're at, which is like so disciplined and focused, and it's like so able to track the results of the work that you're doing, like then you have the ability to see, I think sometimes like foresee trends. So if something starts lagging, you're able to actually know that that matters because you've been so focused in doing the podcast and like
Right.
continuing to stay committed to the podcast. And so that becomes quite magical, but you have to have invested the time to get to that point.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You can't just expect it to show up. As we say in the wealth creation space, right? Wealth creation, compounding interest is still a crockpot way of cooking. Same with content creation. You have to invest the time. It's not going to be that flash in the pan, pressure cooker type mentality of the success. You have to be intentional about it.
So when did you start seeing success after you launched the podcast and focused your market?
About 5 months is when we got our first triage call.
Okay.
At the time, but intro call. But yeah, it was about so we launched the show in September of 2018, changed it to a weekly format in January, and then rebranded to 2020 Money. I believe it was April of 2019. And then our first triage call happened, I believe it was somewhere in the June or July area. So 6 or 7 months after we had changed to the weekly format and started to become a little bit more narrowed with our content.
So you had patience.
Yeah.
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 And fast
nothing
forward
else was working. So my baseline was I burned the ships. I burned the ships, Meg. Like I didn't have anything to fall back on. So it was essentially sink or swim with this approach. And again, I had the confidence to know it was going to work because whether it was Taylor, Ben, good friend of mine, Josh Bannerman, OG on Stacking Ben, like all of these advisors have had varying levels and degrees of success in doing this. I just need to make it my own.
So how has that shown up for you in your business? You said at the end of 2017, you did 250,000 in top line revenue. What's your growth looking like over these last 3 or 4 years?
So at the end of the day, I don't care what you make. I care what you keep. This is why I'm not a big fan of AUM growth and why I don't care what your ADV says. I wish there was a way to, not to insert this conversation or this debate topic into the conversation, but I wish there was a way to create transparency on ADVs that showed the revenue tied to the AUM that is disclosed. But I don't care about AUM. I care what you make. And more importantly, I care what you keep. So I measure things just based off essentially what are sellers' discretionary earnings, or in other words, what are the total owner earnings that I'm getting. And so in 2017, the percentage was 31%. 2018 was 46% of earnings, then 51%. 2020 was a reduction down to 37.5% because I made the investment in 2020 to hire a lead advisor to start taking the onflow of clients that we were getting. 49% in 2021, 56.5% in 2022. Translation to dollars in 2022, it was just shy $500,000 in essentially my total owner's compensation split between a couple of different ways on the profit loss statement.
I mean, I love that you, first of all, look at revenue versus AUM. I think that that's differentiated. And to your point, it really matters, right? If you look at AUM and look at just the growth of AUM, you're not actually seeing the whole story. So I think looking at revenue versus AUM is interesting. I think you're probably one of the only advisory firm owners that I've spoken with that has sort of talked even one layer beyond that, which is sort of your compensation and what you take home at the end of the day. But it's really all about defining, like, what does success look like and how do I measure that success, and understanding what's important to you.
Yeah. I mean, I'm amazed at, I know this is the topic here is organic growth and being successful, but if we're defining success in part or in total by, let's call it what it is, the dollars and cents that the business produces, show me 2 practices that are doing $1 million each, one of them at a 50% margin, the other at a 30% margin. Well, of course, which one, if we're just measuring objectively by the financial performance of the company, of course, I'm going to take the 50% margin practice. So I think that's where A lot of advisors might be lying to themselves, especially through 2020, 2021, 2022, with the significant rise in equity markets. When they would look at their AUM growth, it's like, oh, we're crossing over this threshold, this. It's like, is that market growth or is that net assets added? And even then, on the other side of that, if you have a market correction, does that mean that your business is less successful just because of external forces that are somewhat beyond your control? At the end of the day, measure the revenue that you are generating. And part of the reason, yes, I know revenue is tied to AUM if you are doing an AUM only model. Part of the reason that I candidly don't, it's not that I don't care about AUM, but it's not certainly not the primary way in which we measure the success of the business, is because we charge for financial planning as a separate standalone service. So to just focus on AUM is essentially doing a disservice to half of our business income, because we generate roughly half of our revenue from financial planning fees.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, you have to understand exactly where every dollar is coming in from. It helps you make decisions, have more clarity around decision making when you're clear on that.
Yep.
So I want to deviate for 1 second, and then I'll bring us back to wrap us up. But because I know that you are very generous with your time in the industry and coach many advisors, I'm curious your take on, you're an entrepreneur, a small business owner. You own your business, you run your business the way that you want to run your business. So that's sort of your profile. There are a lot of advisors in the industry who work as part of a larger firm. And so for whatever reason, they've decided to affiliate with a larger firm, or maybe they just were recruited as, out of college and they're still at that firm. And I have heard from people, they'll listen to a conversation like this, Adam, and they'll say like, but I can't really do that because
compliance, right?
Yeah, compliance, or my firm doesn't support me just marketing to, practice owners of optometric businesses who do 850,000 or more in revenue. Like I have to sort of fit into the overall, ethos and vision of the organization that I'm a part of. How do you coach advisors through that?
Do we have time for another session?
I know. Maybe we can come back to it if it's too big.
Well, so I think this first comes back to, what is the advisor solving for in how they want to grow their business? And if the why, or if that is something that they are so passionate about doing that it means them potentially ruffling the feathers enough to go out on their own, then that might be the impetus to push them over the proverbial ledge and hang their own shingle and do that. I would say, I wonder how many advisors have a false sense of restriction around that if they proved their business plan to the overarching authority, dare I say, that is there, right? At the end of the day, let's call a spade a spade. A business is there to generate a profit. A business is there to turn $1 into many, right? Through a multiplication of future earnings. So if you as an advisor that is under the purview of some other leadership organization, if you can bring a plan and other proven concepts, other like success stories of advisors that have done this, and say, here are a half a dozen other advisors that have done what I'm proposing I do. So this isn't me being an entrepreneur and creating something out of scratch that hasn't ever been done before. I'm a business owner that's making a decision to benchmark my process off of somebody that has otherwise been successful. Here's what they have done. Here's my pro forma. At the end of the day, that leadership is going to have to make a decision as to whether or not they're going to support that endeavor or not. I can tell you that it works from a service model standpoint, that you can. I've had conversations with large RIAs, firms with B's in front of them, that have offered to buy our firm. And when I tell them, I don't think you'd be like, initially I would say, I don't think you want to buy us because of our niche. I used to think that was going to be a limiting factor on my enterprise value of my firm. And every single one of them were like, we don't care. I mean, we're buying future cash flow. So if you're demonstrating value to your clients and you can prove that your retention rate is at a certain number, we'd love to add you as a niche advisor in our firm. We've got the infrastructure to serve the clients, continue showing up, deliver the goods. So my point with that is, I don't think it may be as limiting of a belief as what advisors are thinking. I wonder if it is an avoidance behavior that they are probably making a bigger deal out of themselves to essentially squash the fear of, oh, well, I can't do that because my firm won't let me. At least I don't have to jump off that ledge, right? I wonder how much of that is actually happening.
I think you're right. I mean, I think that it's listen, every business operates with constraints. Every business, no matter
Very
what
true.
size, model, emphasis, whatever, like we all operate within constraints. It's just, how do you view the constraints? Do you view them as beautiful constraints, right? Or do you view them as restrictive constraints? And so I think you're right. I think it's probably a little bit more of an excuse than it is a real, actual, like, restrictive constraint. And to your point, everybody across the independent wealth management space is hyper focused on organic growth right now, because the data just shows that as an industry, we're experiencing really anemic growth. We don't have the wind of the markets behind us. So many businesses have chosen to grow through inorganic growth strategies, which is acquisitions, which is a really tough game to be in.
Especially with a rising cost of capital as it is today in today's interest rate environment. We're recording this. Happy Halloween, right? At the October 31st of 2023, where interest rates are right now, like, to your point of acquisitions, the numbers aren't making near as much sense as what they were in 2021, 22, et cetera.
Yeah, it's tough. And so I would doubt that there would be very many executives out there, to your point, if you presented the plan to say, this is why this is important to me. I'm going to make some bets on myself. This is what it's going to look like. This is how it's going to work. I can't imagine that there's many executives out there that won't support you. In fact, what I would hope, and this is because I'm such a fan of this space and the innovation that can and does exist in this space, is I always hope that would be an opportunity to, like, incubate an idea within a larger organization and then demonstrate how much it works and then build it out from there.
Yeah.
And I won't go into too much of a tangent, but we're actually seeing some wealth management platforms. So these are strategic acquirers of businesses that's very core to their model, is going out and finding businesses like yours that have a really specific focus and demonstrated, track record of success, that they say, hey, like, we want to invest into that and then just sort of build around it. And we can do it with multiple types of advisors across the industry.
I bet there's not, I bet there's not a month that goes by that I don't get an email. In fact, we have an autoresponder that my office sends out when we get this email, because it's advisors reaching out, essentially asking, paraphrasing here, I've seen what you've built. I've seen you in Limitless. I've seen the podcast. I love what you're doing. Can I learn from you? And my response is essentially, here's all the resources. It's an autoresponder benchmark from Tim Ferriss. So all credit to Tim. I love what he's done over there. But I link to Limitless. And then I essentially say, if I don't say yes to everybody, I have to say no to, if I can't say yes to everybody, then I have to say no to everybody. But because of the number of advisors that are asking, essentially, help me find the hardest part that every advisor struggles to get: an audience, demonstrated value, demonstrated competence, and a following of people interested in what I have to say and the expertise that I have. One of the things that we're experimenting with is creating essentially the certified optometric advisor. If you're an advisor that wants to advise optometric practices, great. I've got the curriculum. I'm going to build out, here are tools, here are templates. So instead of us growing the firm organically and adding more and more clients to our roster, maybe I build the optometry advisor network. And there's a bunch of us advisors nationwide, each own their own firm that have their own way of doing things. But you have, like, there are so many opportunities for firms that have done what we've done and in other variations of that, to your point, people are wanting to build that in their firm. They're going to spend the capital, right? They have to. They're going to spend the capital. They're either going to buy it, right? Do they build it or do they buy it? Those are essentially the two options in business. We've demonstrated, just based off of rising interest rates, et cetera, that valuations have come down. So the buy aspect of that has become a little bit more expensive. So if we're going to build it, we can demonstrate how many dollars we have to spend today to get X rate of return. So my point, a long, somewhat, again, promotional way of sharing what we're looking at building here, in saying, if you are an advisor in an organization that you feel might be a little captive and not have that agency that you're looking for, I would ask you to knock again and have the conversation with the leadership, because it's no until you ask again.
Right. It's no until you ask. There's so many things that I wanted to cover that we didn't have time for.
I'm
but
sorry.
No, do not be sorry. This is exactly why I was so eager to have you and have this conversation. So I think, just to sort of like begin to wrap us all up, I think what I want to be able, as key takeaways is, you made a decision in your business that you didn't want to be, master of ones, and that you wanted to have greater clarity for the value that you were delivering and who you were delivering it for. And that sort of started the process. So as part of that, you decided you're going to do podcasting, which allowed you to narrow your focus even further. I think in the last four years, you shared with me that you've only onboarded one client who's not a practice owner of an optometric practice that meets your revenue threshold. Like, that's how disciplined you've been. And thank you for sharing the growth that's come out of it, because this is about organic growth and how people can drive towards greater organic growth. And so I think like all of that is a really beautiful demonstration of what's possible when you have the courage and the conviction to say, like, I have value, right? This is my value. This is what I can do. This is what I can deliver. This is who I want to deliver it for. And sort of everything comes out of that. And like you said, you do the podcast. That's what your focus is. But because of that, you are invited to speak. You're invited to write. You're invited to do other things. You're not totally limited to the podcast. But all of your marketing has become intuitive. To your point, it's sort of just rinse, lather, repeat. Or lather, rinse, repeat, I should say. And so like it's working, it's demonstrated in the growth of your business. You're a bigger firm. I also know, and we won't have time to talk about it, but that you're, I noticed on your website that you've opened your wait list for your 2020 money membership, which I think is for people who owners of optometry practices that don't meet that revenue threshold.
Correct. It's our way to essentially democratize financial advice for our ideal clients and help them become brilliant at the basics, so that when they don't, or if they come to us because they listen to the podcast or whatever that might be, and they look, because we are very clear on the website who we do our best work for qualitatively and quantitatively, we want somewhere else for them to go to allow us to deliver value, for them to get the answers to the questions that they're looking for, and essentially nurture them along to help them in a guided independence approach. And if potentially at some point in the future, they graduate out of that membership program or become self-sustaining where they just do it on their own, great. So be it. That's going to be their choice. But yeah, the launch of the 2020 money membership is going to be coming up we're launching the first cohort in January of 2024.
And I think it's so important to call those things out in addition to the, certification that you're talking about with advisors, because if you go back to the question you asked yourself about, how many practices are there, like, what are we talking about? And then you got 30,000 practices, and of those
11,000 practices, about 30,000 plus optometrists, roughly. There's not exact data on the number of practices, but ballparking here, it's about 11,000 practices nationwide.
Okay. Thank you for that clarification. And you asked yourself the question, can I get 70 of those? And so that's where you started. But today, look at the business opportunities that you're uncovering, right? So yes, you have been, and you continue to stay really narrowly focused on your market, but the business opportunities that are coming out of it are so exciting. And honestly, I know you're part of Limitless, but it feels limitless, right? It feels like,
it is.
So I
go back and I look at the fact that my original plan was can I just find 70 ODs? Can I just find 70 practices nationwide? And now the version of the business plan that we're working towards, and we have the projections, we have the forecast out, is 2.5 million in revenue, 2 full-time advisors, 200 households at the margins that I'm talking about. So advisors can do the math on that. And then the other businesses, the involvement in Limitless, the membership, the coaching that I do, you build the infrastructure and you trust and bet on yourself, not to sound as cliche as possible in the closing thoughts that we have here. But if you become confident and convicted in the value that you can deliver to the ideal client, stay true to that, surround yourself with the people and the team that you need to excel in what you are best in the world at doing, and allow them the freedom and agency to do what they are in the best in the world at doing, and put your message out into the marketplace unapologetically, dare I say, you can't help but be successful.
Well, that's just the best wrap up that we could possibly have. So thank you so much, Adam, for being here with me and sharing all of your insights and your journey and the outcomes that have come out of it. I think your story is quite powerful, because I think it's so tangible, right? For advisors to see it and feel it and understand it. So thank you very much for being here with me. And thank you to everyone who tuned in today. If you have any follow-up questions, Adam, can they find you? Is it best to find you on LinkedIn?
They can find me on LinkedIn. I am admittedly probably the world's worst social media advisor. I know that might be counterintuitive to what we're talking about here, but before we hit record, we talked about protecting our time and being very intentional about where we spend it. Yeah, you can try on LinkedIn, but admittedly, yeah, I'm probably the worst advisor when it comes to that, because I just know where my best and
Well,
highest
you
use of
don't
time
have,
is in the
yeah,
business.
because you don't have
Um,
to be like,
yeah,
right?
kind of.
You don't,
I don't mean to put myself out there and say, "Hey, I'm on the show," but you can't reach out to me. Um, LinkedIn, if you're going to message or if you're going to reach out, yes, LinkedIn is the best way. Comment if however this gets released on your end, tag me in that post, tag me on LinkedIn. That's probably the best social channel to reach out to me. Of course, if you're interested in the work that I'm doing with other advisors and kind of get a peek behind the curtain, you can always check us out at limitlesslife.fa as well.
yeah, absolutely. And for me, everyone knows where to find me, LinkedIn, as well as we publish my Calendly link in the show notes for everything that we publish. So thank you everyone for tuning in. Thank you again, Adam, for being here. It is Halloween, so I'll just end with happy Halloween.
Thank you, Meg. Happy Halloween as well. Thank you so much for the privilege and pleasure of sharing the conversation today.